Ta-da! Look what I've got! Well, it's a null object. Duh! You can't see it because it's invisible. Well, I don't see you come up with anything better. Screw this! Hey guys, in today's tutorial I will talk about null objects. Null objects mystify a lot of people, not only because of the name, but they are invisible and by themselves they do jack all. You can actually assign effects to your null object layers, but unless you link those effects to other visible layers, they won't make much of a difference. However, null objects are very useful for marking, tracking and controlling other elements in your composition. A null object is just a marker with a position, a rotation and a scale. You can then parent other layers to your null object and, by moving the null object, control the movement of all of the children. Null objects are especially useful for storing camera tracking information because once you've tracked your footage and applied the tracker data to your null object, the null object will seem to be stuck to your footage and follow the camera's movement. You can then parent elements to that null object and they will also follow your camera's movement. Now let's jump right into After Effects so I can show you how to create and use null objects. There are a number of different things that you can use null objects for. Let's first look at how null objects, in combination with parenting, can provide you with a simple and clean way of controlling the position, scale and rotation of other layers in your composition. Here's a small clip with 4 rotating rings. Note that each of these rings is a separate layer and therefore we can select and reposition them independently. But what if that's not what we want? What if we wanted to rotate all of these rings around the center of the composition? Now, if we select all of the layers at once, we can move them as a group, but notice what happens when we try to rotate them. They all rotate around their individual anchor points, which sits in the middle of each ring. Similarly, if we scale them, each of them is scaled independently around their own anchor point. This, however, is not what we want. We want them to move, rotate and scale as a group around the center of the composition. If you've been following a few of my other tutorials, you will probably realize that you can just pre-compose all of the layers at this point. But for this tutorial, let's instead use a null object to solve our problem. First, create a new null object by going to Layer, New, Null Object. This new null object, displayed as a small rectangle with 9 handle points in the preview window, will be completely invisible when you export your final video. By default, the anchor and therefore the position of the null object is defined by its top left corner. And the handles you can see are simply there to make it easy to select, reposition, scale and rotate the null object. Select the null object layer and press Enter on your keyboard to rename it. I will call it Parent. Now parent all of the ring layers to it. I have a separate tutorial available on parenting that I recommend you check out if you don't know how to do this. Now that we linked all ring layers to the null object, we can move the null object and all of the rings will follow its movement. We can scale the null object and all of the rings will be scaled up or down in relation to the position of their parent. We can rotate the null object and all of the ring layers will rotate around the anchor point of the null object. Very convenient. Let's animate all of these rings to rotate around the null object using a very simple expression. Reveal the rotation property of the parent null object by selecting the layer and pressing R on your keyboard. Alt-click on the stopwatch icon to enable the expression editor and into the text field type time *50. Done! Return to the beginning of your composition. Since we don't need to see the null object unless we actually want to work with it, disable its visibility for now. If you playback your clip now, the rings will automatically rotate around the invisible null object and therefore around the center of the composition. Now that you know how to use null objects to control other layers in your composition, let me quickly show you a more practical example. Here's a clip that you may already have seen before. It's a simple camera pan over some farmland. I have already tracked the footage and applied the tracking position data to a null object that I call tracking null. When we select the null object, you can see that its position is keyframed for every frame and it follows the movement of the power pole throughout the entire shot. I have a separate tutorial on motion tracking that you can check out if you want to learn how to track your footage. Now let's set one of the fields on fire. I will use a fire stock element from the Actions Essential 2 package by Video Copilot. As per usual, I will provide a few links to free stock footage elements in the description of the video in case you do not have or can't afford Actions Essentials. Drag the fire element into your scene. Let's scale it down so it fits a little bit better into the background of our shot and position it on top of one of the dried out fields. Yeah, that looks about right. If we now scrub through the footage, Well, that didn't work. The fire just stays where it is and it does not follow the camera's movement. But since we tracked our footage and applied the tracking data to our null object, all that is left to do is to parent the fire we just placed in the scene to the null object. And voila, the fire element now also properly follows the camera's movement. That was nice and easy, and I hope you start to see the use of null objects in combination with parenting. Now let's look at a slightly more advanced use for null objects. How we can use null objects to control any effect parameter that represents a position. What I have here is a composition that contains nothing but the Surface Studio logo. Let's say we wanted to add some lens flare to the scene. I'm going to use the Optical Flare plugin from Video Copilot, but remember that I'm just trying to explain how to use null objects to control position parameters for your effects. What effects in particular you control with them is entirely up to you. First, I will create a new solid by going to Layer, New, Solid. I will call this new solid Lens Flare. Next, I will apply the Optical Flares effect onto the new solid layer. Again, I know this is a separate plugin, but keep in mind this could be any other effect that has a position property like a bulge or a particle effect. I've got a nice lens flare effect here, but let's pick a preset that might suit a little bit better. I will just quickly jump into the options for the Optical Flares effect, go down to the presets, and let's look at the motion graphics presets. This one looks pretty awesome. Blue Moon. Let's go with that. Notice that I can control the position of the lens flare by dragging around this little position indicator in my preview window. Actually, let's set the render mode to on transparent so we can see the image underneath the lens flare. And let's reposition the lens flare to the top left corner of the logo. I will also set the blend mode of the lens flare layer to add to blend it a bit nicer into my scene. That looks cool. Now let's assume for whatever reason that the lens flare layer is no longer selected. I will simply unselect it for now. Note that the little position indicator for the lens flare effect is no longer available to us, and now if we try to reposition the lens flare, we will actually end up selecting and dragging around the entire layer rather than just the position of the flare. This is not what we want. In order to reveal the little position indicator again, we have to go back over to the Effect Control panel and select the Optical Flares effect. Now we can adjust the position of the lens flare again as before. This can get quite tedious, especially when dealing with a large number of position properties for several effects. Fortunately, we can make our life a lot easier by linking the position property of our effect to a null object. Create a new null object as we did before by going to Layer, New, Null Object. Let's drag the null object to where we can better see it and rename it to Lens Position. Now for the magic. Reveal the position of the null object by pressing P on your keyboard. We will need to be able to see this property as we will link the lens flare position to it in a moment. Now select the layer that contains whatever effect you want to link and Alt-click on the appropriate position property. For the lens flare effect, I will Alt-click on the Position XY property. The expression editor will open up, but rather than typing anything into it, simply select the Pick Whip icon and drag it onto the position property for your null object. This will link the position property of your effect to the position of the null object in your scene. The moment we click outside of the expression editor, we will see the lens flare position snap to where the null object is. Awesome! And here's why it is awesome. Unselect all layers. As before, we cannot see the position marker for the lens flare effect. But since we've linked the lens flare position to the position of the null object, we can now grab the null object and move it to control the position of the lens flare effect. This is much easier, and you can link any position property of any effect to a null object. You can even link multiple properties to the same null or create new ones as required to make it easier for you to manage your effect more efficiently. Now let's look at the final use for null objects, as container for expression controls. What I have set up here are two simple lens flare effects that fade in and then fade out again. And again, this is not specific to the lens flare effect, but is something that you can use no matter what effects you're working with. The issue with this setup is that I have two separate layers and two separate sets of keyframes to fade the lens flares in and out. If I make changes to one, chances are I will have to change the other ones to match. This can become a real nightmare if you have a large number of layers where you need to keep all of the keyframes in sync. But fear not, null objects, this time in combination with expression controls, will allow us to greatly simplify this setup. To show you how this works, I will first remove the keyframes on both lens flare layers. Next, I will rename my null object layer to Control, as we won't be linking anything directly to it. Rather, it will contain expression controls that I will use to manage the effects in my composition more effectively. Go over to the Effects and Presets panel and search for the slider control effect. This is a simple expression control, and I have a much more detailed tutorial on expression controls if you want to learn more about them. Simply apply the slider control effect to your null object layer. Since I will use the slider to control the brightness of both of my lens flare effects at once, I will rename the slider to lens brightness. Next, reveal the slider effect on your null object layer so we can link it up using the pick whip icon. Then go over to the effects that you want to link to your expression control. Since I want to link the brightness parameter of the optical flares effect, I will alt-click on the stopwatch icon next to it. Now use the pick whip icon to select the appropriate slider property on your control null object. This will link the brightness parameter of the optical flares effect to the value of the slider that is sitting on our null object. Repeat the same process for any other effect parameters that you want to link. So what did we get out of this exercise now? Well, now the brightness parameters for both of our lens flare layers are linked to a single slider expression control that sits on our control null object. By changing the value of this single slider expression control, we will affect the value of all effect parameters that we link to it. You can see how the brightness of both flares is controlled by the slider. Let's animate the slider again, so set a few keyframes as required to fade your effects in and out. That was very simple, and it ensures that both lens flares are always in sync. It's easy now to make changes if we wanted to, for example, add a small flash towards the end of the animation. Simply reveal the keyframes for the control null object and add a few new ones onto the lens brightness slider where required. It will affect both lens flare effects as expected without us having to fiddle with too many different sets of keyframes. Note that you do not necessarily need to use a null object to contain all your expression controls. Personally though, I think this is the cleanest way to manage complex effects, and it is another great thing that you can do with null objects in Adobe After Effects. I really hope you enjoyed this basics tutorial, and as always, please leave any comments, questions or suggestions in the section below. Please subscribe if you want to see more, or come and stalk me on Facebook or Twitter. Until next time, I will see you later. Oh, hey there, little fella. What do you want? You hungry? Maybe I have